Welcome to our CVI Talks. We are very excited and thankful that you joined us today. I'm Mary Bro, the CVI Director at Sam Houston State University. Here at the Crime Victims Institute, we are committed to advancing research on victimization issues in Texas by conducting research to examine the impact of crime of all ages to promote a better understanding of victimization and assist victims of crime by giving them a voice. With that, it is our hope that the information presented in today's CVI Talks will be informative and helpful to your field of service. At this time, I will turn it over to our research assistants, Alyssa Linares and Taylor Robinson.
Hello, my name is Alyssa Linares. I received my bachelor's in victim studies from Sam Houston State University, and now I'm pursuing my master's in victim services management.
Hi, my name is Taylor Robinson. I received my bachelor's in criminal justice and minoring in forensic science and my master's in victim service management, and I'm now pursuing my doctorate in criminal justice.
Ms. Hilderbrand, can you explain your background as the Coordinated Community Response Coordinator for the Texas Council on Family Violence?
Yes, thank you for having me. I am a licensed master social worker. I've been with the Texas Council on Family Violence since about 2014, off and on. And the work that we do in my role is a lot of training and education for service providers, predominantly family violence programs, the advocates and leadership within shelters and non-residential service providers, as well as battering intervention and prevention providers and facilitators. We conduct training and education, as well as audits for state-funded service providers who serve family violence offenders. And then the majority of the work that I do is coordinated community response. So helping systems leadership within communities, finding ways to reduce barriers for survivors of domestic violence, enhance accountability for offenders, and really find ways for communities to work together to help families experiencing family violence. And prior to my work with TCFE, I worked at the Austin Police Department in their victim services unit, working with family violence survivors, as well as intimate partner violence, sexual assault survivors and victims. And then prior to that, I worked at the National Domestic Violence Hotline as a hotline advocate. And then I was a residential victims advocate for a local shelter in mid-Missouri, working that third shift, nights and weekends. So yeah, this is predominantly my world, and I'm really passionate about the work, and I'm excited to chat with you all about what that has looked like with TCFE and systems level work and change, because that's where the good work happens.
Dr. Loud, can you explain your background as an assistant professor of social work at Texas Southern University?
Yes, good morning. So my background actually begins working as a case manager investigator with Adult Protective Services. I was there for about 5 years, and I learned so much. And so after that, transferred to Texas Southern University as a faculty member in the Department of Social Work. So there I teach a variety of courses, introduction, legislation, human behavior, and I also teach the department's violence class, which is violence across the lifespan. I also engage in research, and so most of my research focuses on different aspects of sexuality, substance use, health equity, as well as different facets of family violence. I serve as the project director for the TSU SHAPE initiative, and it is a service program on campus, 3rd Ward, as well as 5th Ward. So we focus on sexual health, and I can't tell you how much violence can intersect with this particular category of services. So we notice a lot, we do a lot in terms of trying to not just address the core issue, but also those things that kind of happen around it with regard to different aspects of violence.
Ms. Hilderbrand, can you define family violence and describe the different categories that are included under this umbrella term?
Sure, and I invite Dr. Loud to add in any definitional things that I forget or miss. But for me, my expertise really relies on and focuses in on intimate partner violence. So I'll start with that, but I'll broaden it up just a little bit. But here at the Texas Council, we believe that family violence is a pattern of coercive and controlling behavior that may include physical, sexual, psychological, emotional, verbal, and financial abuse. family violence centers on the concept of one person wanting to have power and control over another with whom they have an intimate relationship. And this pattern of controlling and abusive behavior is typically referred to as intimate partner violence, which tends to be my default when talking about the topic. But I know that the conversation is also about family violence in general. So when we think about intimate partner violence, we often experience definition issues, which makes answering your question a little bit more complex. So age is a factor where relationships between adolescents who may not have been physical or sexual in nature, the relationship may have only lasted a few days or weeks. Individuals or adults who are dating, but who have not yet been, quote, intimate, or have a short dating duration, or stalking victims who may not have ever had an existing relationship with their offender, are also still considered intimate partner violence as well. When we think about the criminal legal system, that definition tends to be much more narrow. So family violence legally can mean intimate partner violence, like I mentioned, as well as familial abuse or violence between roommates. So this can look like siblings who are violent, children who are violent towards their older parents, or violence that can occur between folks who are not family or intimate, but maybe share a house together, like roommates. There are types of violence that I mentioned that aren't necessarily a crime. So things like yelling at a partner or controlling where they're allowed to go or who they can talk to, or degrading partners, how they look, aren't necessarily against the law, but and don't necessarily fall within the criminal legal definition. But if a line is crossed where there are threats that are happening, someone is following where that partner is going, or they're preventing someone from leaving, then that crosses into the criminal threshold. But all of those behaviors culminate into what I would define as family violence. So I hope that helps answer the question in a lengthy way. But if there's anything I forgot, please feel free to hop in, Dr. Loud.
I think you covered it. And I mean, family violence is broad. It's a broad category. And I didn't want to jump ahead, but it speaks to the trends in how we categorize it or recognize what's considered family violence. So I think you hit it.
Dr. Loud, can you provide statistics for this type of victimization, or have you seen any patterns or trends involving family violence?
Absolutely. So just like Ms. Hilderbrand was saying, when it comes to family violence, we've seen that shift or that trend in trying to understand what constitutes family violence. And how we look at it. When we think about family violence, we may not automatically start thinking about stalking by a stranger, or we may not think about human trafficking and how that can play a role, and that still falls within it as well. So I think there's so much variability that's a trend that you should expect to see continue as we continue to learn more. I also think there's a trend around perceptions of that as based on our culture that are socially mediated. One of the things I teach my classes is the case of Mary Ellen Wilson, and how she is kind of recognized as the start of child abuse or child prevention laws, in terms of they didn't have any. And so they had to go in and use what we had for, at that time, animal prevention of cruelty to animals, in order to kind of get her out of a bad situation. And so from there, we moved into being able to create legislation for the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, and so on and so forth. Same thing with, at a time where women could not file charges or get any restitution or whatnot from abuse by a spouse, and then dating violence, and looking at how far we've come, and that all of that's been socially mediated in terms of how we see it and how we respond to it. And I would say another trend is looking at the ways in which family violence is operationalized from a research perspective. So Ms. Hilderbrand was talking about that in terms of, like, one study may look at family violence from a criminal aspect versus another study that looks at it from, maybe includes those non-physical forms of violence that wouldn't necessarily be criminal. And the way a study is created, of course, yields different results. And so thinking about how all of that plays a role, because what we know, we can only respond to what we know or whatnot. So I think those are some of the primary trends that speak to family violence or what we know about it. So from a statistical perspective, and say in class, we like to break up family violence into those three primary categories: dealing with children, dealing with elders, and intimate partner violence. But with children, what we know is that there are about 4.4 million referrals made to CPS. That involves approximately 8 million children. So this was just in 2019. Now, only 50% of those referrals are on average screened in. Okay, so then of that 50%, approximately 700,000 reports are actually substantiated. The trend in terms of the different types of maltreatment, usually neglect is the largest category, followed by physical abuse, followed by sexual abuse. About 15% of those are reported as multiple forms of maltreatment. Now, it depends on what you read, but you'll get different numbers sometimes, and that's going back to how we operationalize, and everyone does it a little bit differently. We've also seen there's been a 10% increase in the number of child fatalities as a result of abuse and neglect since 2015. And what we know about the perpetrators, that typically there is usually one or both parents, starting with the mother, followed by the father, followed by another relative or an unmarried parental-like figure. Okay, so that's generally the trend when it comes to children. Now, with regard to elders, we receive about 1.3 million referrals on average, over 750,000 clients. And about 60% of these referrals are actually screened in. The maltreatment trend is the same, in that self-neglect is typically most of the reports, followed by actual reports of neglect by others, exploitation, physical abuse, and then sexual abuse. Most of the perpetrators that we see in these particular cases are females, 36%, followed by males. And then when it comes to gender, in reference to the different types of maltreatment, male gender is most likely associated with physical, sexual, and emotional, whereas female gender is most likely associated with abandonment, neglect, and exploitation. So I'm just wanting to highlight how some of the trends are somewhat consistent across the various categories. And then, like Ms. Hilderbrand was saying, well, in these numbers, they shift depending on who you read, but most recent reports, about 5.3 million adult females are affected by or experience IPV. In general, most accounts say 1 in 3 females, 1 in 4 males can experience rape, physical violence, or stalking. 1 in 3 high school students experience some form of dating violence, and that females are more likely to experience death as a result of violence by an intimate partner when compared to males. So I know that's a lot of information. I'm just wanting to kind of get you to see how the trends are somewhat very similar in terms of the statistics.
Ms. Hilderbrand, how have current events such as the pandemic affected family violence rates?
That's a good question. And just to follow up with Dr. Laub's commentary just around statistics and those sorts of things, at the Texas Council on Family Violence, we produce a report called Honoring Texas Victims, which is the analysis of the women and men who have been killed by an intimate partner every year here in the state of Texas. And that's actually my team that researches that report and produces it annually. And so I'll talk a little bit about that next, but I think it's a great tie-in to what she was talking about, just statistics in general. But to answer your question about the pandemic, so community disasters, whether it's a hurricane or a public health disaster like COVID-19, they exacerbate the risk for domestic violence survivors. Resources are strained, supportive connections are diminished, and accountability for the abuse is reduced when our focus is on the disaster response or our systems of justice are interrupted. As the pandemic has lingered, survivors and their abusive partners faced additional compounding stressors stemming from job losses, housing instability, health concerns, and lack of childcare. Isolation and stressors related to the pandemic exacerbated the risk posed by people who abuse their partners and the vulnerabilities of domestic violence survivors, and contributed to the highest number of intimate partner homicides recorded by TCFE since its first publication of the Honoring Texas Victims report. In 2020, we reported a 23% increase in intimate partner violence homicides compared to the year prior, where 185 men and women were killed in 2019 by a partner. In 2020, 228 Texas men and women were killed by a current or former intimate partner in 68 counties across the state. So that stat includes 183 women killed by their male partners, 40 men killed by their female partners, and 1 woman and 4 men killed by their same-sex partners. In addition, 31 family members, friends, or bystanders were killed during the commission of these homicides. It's hard to calculate the exact impact of the pandemic on domestic violence perpetration, as some, if not most, abuse goes unreported to authorities. Just a small percentage is actually reported. The National Commission on COVID-19 and Criminal Justice estimates that domestic violence or intimate partner violence incidences increased around 8% following lockdown orders during the 2020 pandemic, though those rates have really varied by jurisdiction. In Dallas, for example, researchers found that 12.5% increase in domestic violence incidences in the 3 weeks after a stay-at-home order went into effect compared to the 3 weeks before. Overall, Texas saw a 16% increase in victims reporting domestic violence to law enforcement during the first month of stay-at-home orders, and a 10% increase the full year after the onset of the pandemic compared to the year before. Based on the Texas Department of Public Safety's Uniform Crime Report, the database that all law enforcement jurisdictions report their crime statistics to is the Uniform Crime Report, which is what we utilize in our Honoring Texas Victims report as a starting point for our research. It tallies the annual incidences reported for family violence. One particularly notable stat is the presence of firearms in these incidences, which increased by almost 60% after the pandemic started. So that's just the presence of a firearm, not necessarily a death or a homicide, but just the actual presence. Very significant impacts of the pandemic on families experiencing violence at home, as you can imagine. So,
Dr. Lau, given the wide array of situations that can be included under the term family violence, what is the most commonly recognized form of family violence, and what are hidden forms of family violence that are least recognized?
Some of the most recognized forms of family violence, I would say, would be child maltreatment and intimate partner violence. And the reason I say that is more so around the history and the amount of time that we put in to studying these particular issues, the responses and the policies that we've created over the years, the money, the resources that we've, put into trying to address these issues. So in terms of visibility and conversation and awareness, I'd say that those 2 areas are probably the most recognized. And for some of the most hidden forms, I definitely say, I think sexual abuse, especially incestuous relationships, remains a hidden form of family violence, as well as sibling abuse. Sibling abuse is one of those areas where we really don't have as much research about it. And a lot of that has to do with the way in which we, as a culture, it's kind of normalize the things that happen between siblings. But what we're learning and what we're seeing is that type of violence can have just as a negative impact as other types of violence if it goes unchecked. And thinking about the trends that we just talked about across all the various categories, sexual abuse typically is at the end of that. And with that means that we just simply don't have enough research to really understand what's really happening. I think we tend to underestimate sexual abuse, especially among elders, for a variety of reasons. So hopefully that's understandable in terms of the 2 predominant categories, what's most recognized versus least recognized.
Ms. Hilderbrand, what are some common signs that a person is being victimized by a family member?
So I'll probably just key in on 3 things, and I'll touch first on intimate partner violence, just common signs that someone is experiencing intimate partner violence within their relationship with their spouse or partner. There's 3 things that I would highlight: just physical signs, emotional signs, and behavioral signs. For physical, obviously, you would sort of key in on things like weak or inconsistent explanations of injuries. A victim may or survivor may isolate from friends or family. You may notice self-esteem changes, being fearful, experiencing more depression, having a friend or family member talk about changes in their sleep patterns, increased anxiety, canceling appointments or meetings, or friend dates, activities, things like that, dropping out of activities they typically enjoy. So if you have a friend or family member who goes to the gym, every other day and, starts to drop out of that, experiencing excessive privacy or concerning their personal life or their partner, or becoming reserved and distant. In terms of emotional, there's an aspect of controlling behavior. So indicating that they need to ask for permission to go places, having to respond to constant phone calls or texts or messages, having very little money available to them or needing to ask for money to do things, not having access to a vehicle or having to ask for permission to utilize a vehicle, or referring to their partner as overly jealous or possessive. But as someone who is witnessing these things, I think, or observing these things, and you're having sort of that gut feeling and you're wondering whether or not something is going on, I think being open and asking your friend or family member who you may suspect is being abused, and letting them know that you are a resource for them in a non-judgmental and supportive way. One of the things I took away from me when I was in college doing this work was 3 things you can do, the best things you can do for someone who may be experiencing violence at home is listening to them. So listening to their story, listening to how they feel, how it impacts them, supporting them. So supporting their decisions, whether that's to stay or to go, and believing them, most importantly. So listening, supporting, and believing are the best things that you can do as a friend or family member who you may suspect is experiencing violence at home with a partner. The signs of abuse and violence outside of an intimate partner relationship are a little bit different, because that coercive control may or may not be there in the same level that it is with a intimate partner. I think a lot of those signs that I mentioned earlier would still be present, especially around the physical things, but there may not be as much controlling behavior that you see or manipulation that you see within the relationship. So if it's 2 roommates, there may not be as much controlling or manipulative or behavior in that way. It may just be more violence at home, or controlling of access to resources with the home, or a lot more calls to police or law enforcement in those cases. That sort of intimate relationship component isn't there, which makes calling for help a little bit different compared to a partner who's abusing a wife or husband in that different way. Dr. Ladd, if there's anything else I missed, please feel free to jump in.
No, I mean, I always look at, when it comes to thinking about things and talking about risk or some of those things that go along with it, I always like to start off by saying violence has no respect of person in terms of background, socioeconomic status. It can happen to anyone. And so that when I'm thinking about this, or trying to put together, I always tell my students, think of just a baseline profile and be prepared to adjust that as needed, because like all of the things that Ms. Hilderbrand mentioned, those are various things, but you could see one in isolation and we may jump to conclusions. So you always have to think about it in context.
Dr. Loud, what victim characteristics increase their risk for family violence victimization?
So based on what we know, just breaking up the three main categories, what we know for children, those most at risk will be the younger they are, So younger age there's a higher risk in terms of experiencing violence. In terms of gender, females experience violence more than those male gender. It says here American Indian, Alaska Natives, or the predominant ethnic group that experiences the highest rates of victimization, followed by African Americans. And then when it comes to fatalities of children, those under the age of 1. And if you think about it, the level of vulnerability there is just extremely high. They're completely dependent on their caretakers. So those are some of the characteristics for children. Now, when it comes to elders, the older they are, the higher the risk of vulnerability. We see here female gender, there's still a higher propensity there. In terms of ethnicity, we have more reports from white women in particular, followed by African American, and then there's a large segment that's identified as unknown. Those that are diagnosed with ambulatory or cognitive issues, that also increases one's risk. And it's not uncommon to have a report amongst the elder population where they have prior reports. So about 45% of them who are reported have been reported before. All of those in conjunction work together to increase someone's risk in this particular group. And then like Ms. Hilderbrand was saying, in terms of intimate partners, we've got poverty can be a factor, as well as affluence can be a factor. The need to support children, even maybe parents, a lot of people are caretakers, or even pets. That can increase risk. Living in rural areas and talking about the firearms, just having that in the home can increase risk. Any type of limitation, physical or intellectual limitations, immigrant status for some people, that can increase risk. Being in a same or transgender oriented relationship, because we know there are limited resources in terms of that. History of military service, military sexual assault is a big issue for female, especially for female veterans. And so there's a lot of research and prevention going into addressing military sexual assault. And of course, just being of an older age, especially for older women, they kind of caught in that gap between the services that may be available for, middle-aged or younger women and needing a different type of care that maybe a lot of shelters or whatnot can't provide. So they're kind of caught in that area. So being older. So those are some of the risk factors for each of the primary categories.
Dr. Lau, what perpetrator characteristics increase their likelihood of family violence perpetration?
There are quite a few overlapping sort of characteristics when it comes to perpetrators. Some of the more common characteristics, if there's any involvement with alcohol or drugs, and more so like those that are not of a temporary nature, is kind of how we look at it, that dependence on alcohol or drug use. History of violence is definitely a risk factor. Also looking at families that experience financial stressors, that can definitely be a factor as well. Inadequate housing. There's quite a bit of research that have identified relationships or associations among those who receive some sort of public assistance, which I think falls into the financial stressor sort of category. If caregivers have any type of disability of any kind, that can also raise risk around the perpetrators as well. And then Ms. Hilderbrand, correct me if I'm wrong, but around IPV, there are other characteristics associated, maybe the need for excessive dependence, jealousy, that abusive history, or just the need for power may be a little bit more exclusive to the IPV category. So when I look at the different areas, I'm always looking for themes to kind of help make sense of all the information. And those are just some of the common characteristics that are identified in the literature. And I just want to say it again, everything is in context. So when we're working with these different populations to try to look at that big picture is super important, because we never want to unfairly categorize someone with one or two or more characteristics.
If I could just follow up too around just like the characteristics of an offender, of a family violence offender, or that sort of piece. I think Dr. Loud is accurate. One tool that is handy and utilized heavily within the battering intervention and prevention world and work, which is a specific type of treatment for family violence offenders, intimate partner violence offenders, is the power and control wheel, which is a pretty universal tool at this point in time around family violence. I think that there are some statistics that talk about family violence offenders witnessing violence at home, and being more likely to perpetrate violence into adulthood with their own partners. But that's also can be contradicted by men who witness violence at home and never grow up to be abusive towards their partners. So I think it's kind of like a hit or a miss in that regard. But I will say that, witnessing violence makes someone more likely to become abusive with their own partners into adulthood. There's also just a piece around in the power and control wheel around male privilege that I think is really important to, and is usually kind of brushed aside, but I think that there's a large piece that plays into those sort of beliefs of being, like king of the house, and my partner is supposed to do X, Y, and Z, and if she doesn't, there are consequences. And having those sorts of beliefs, internalized beliefs, are just sort of a risk factor for how you're going to treat your partner in the future. And when you think about battering intervention, another piece that is heavily emphasized is really the equality wheel, and how partners work on equality within the relationship and healthy relationships as well. And really working to modify the beliefs around male privilege and those sorts of stereotypical gender roles that are inherently problematic. So there's that piece to add.
I love that you added the risk associated with cultural beliefs, because that's super important. And I know one of the questions I get often is like, what do you do with that? How do you intervene? How do you, make a difference? And we always teach about, working with people where they are, as opposed to necessarily trying to get them to where you want them to be. And so when you're dealing with that, sometimes we can only move the wheel a little bit in terms of recognizing how, what's wellness, or what's wholeness in terms of relationships. And so I don't think you can underestimate the role of culture and what that, for machismo in some cultures, or just beliefs about the hierarchy in terms of elders and whatnot. So thank you for bringing that up.
Ms. Hilderbrand, who commonly reports family violence?
I think anyone can report family violence if they want to report family violence. And if a neighbor hears something going on, they can make a report. Friends or family can make a report. Now, in regards to intimate partner violence, it's not uncommon for a neighbor or friend to call police if you're viewing reporting as reporting to law enforcement. However, within the criminal legal system, you need to have an offender and a victim to interview, so that it gets complicated. In Texas, there are no laws around mandated reporting for intimate partner violence. Mandatory reporting laws in Texas pertain to the requirement that an individual report suspected of abuse or neglect of children, or abuse or neglect or exploitation of elderly or adults with disabilities to law enforcement or DFPS. But within the state, everyone is technically considered a mandated reporter, but mandatory reporting laws do not exist in the state of Texas as it pertains to intimate partner violence. So if I know my friend is being abused by her husband, I'm not required to make a report to law enforcement. And I would encourage folks to really have a good conversation with their friends and family before, while well-intentioned, making a decision to do something like that, because it can have greater consequences for a victim or survivor or her family if a report is made without her knowledge or her consent. So I would encourage folks to really have a solid conversation with someone before a report is made. Now, if you are a neighbor and you hear something happening and you think someone is in danger, like absolutely call. But if you know your friend is being in an abusive relationship and you just want to call the police because you're frustrated or you want her to get help and she's not getting the help you think she needs, that is a different situation. So those are conversations you need to have with victims and survivors around what's best for them, and falling back on that listening and supporting and believing them piece that is really, really important for being a supportive advocate for her journey into safety. Just because you want someone to report doesn't mean that she's going to be safe. Calling law enforcement doesn't equal safety. Leaving an abusive relationship does not equal safety. In fact, when a woman leaves an abusive relationship or violent relationship, it is the most dangerous time for her. So there is a lot of prep that needs to go into that process to try and keep someone as safe as possible. So those are some pieces to consider. I also think it's important to consider what exactly, when you think about reporting, means. So who reports? Is that a conversation that you just have between, you suspect someone is being victimized at home? Is that just instead of reporting to law enforcement, is that just a conversation between you and that person, letting them know, like, I have a suspicion that you're being harmed. I'm fearful for you. I want you to feel safe and comfortable in your home. I love you. You're a good person. You deserve more. And falling back on those sorts of pieces as well.
Yeah, I agree, Ms. Hilderbrand. Communication is key, building that relationship, trusting and believing. It's the same thing when dealing with, I think, children and elders as well. Most of the people who make the reports to CPS and APS are professionals because of their professional obligations. I think it's anywhere 65% of all those reports. And then after that category, then you have relatives, I think, fall second. So most of the people who do report are those who, I guess, come into contact with members of these different populations for professional reasons. And so it's the same thing here when we think about and talk about the children and the elders, because there's so many other factors that come into play. I mean, with elders, they still have the right to self-determination. So, you can make the report, you can know something's going on, but still they have the right to say, well, I don't want any help. And so you got to think about it from that aspect. Whereas for children, there's a different sort of standard for that and how we respond. So I just think all the variability around who's required and, it can be very confusing. And I think that also contributes to what we need to do, or the lack of response in some areas versus others, or what's more recognized than other types as well.
Dr. Loud, are certain age groups more vulnerable to family violence?
Yes, like we said, with children, the younger they are, the more likely they are to experience vulnerability. I would say adolescents are an extremely vulnerable group as well in terms of their own physical and cognitive development. They're at that stage where Erickson says they're focused on, intimacy or building identity and things of that nature. And so they're trying to figure out where they are. And then you have to think about the relationships. Of course, not all adolescents have tumultuous relationships with their parents or caretakers, but part of that developing oneself, maybe they don't understand, maybe they think that what's happening with them in terms of their dating is normal, or they should. So there's a lot there in terms of vulnerability. And then of course, older adults, we talked a little bit about cognitive and ambulatory limitations that can almost, isolate elders to where they rely on their adult children, but they fear being forced into something that's way more restrictive than what they really want. And so there's being in that section alone, there's vulnerability there. And the older they get, the problem becomes more and more pronounced. And so those are some key areas with regard to age that I think increases one's vulnerability.
Ms. Hildebrand, what are some barriers to reporting the different forms of family violence?
In addition to some of the things that have already been mentioned previously, some of the biggest barriers to reporting, in my opinion, especially with intimate partner violence, would be immigration, LGBTQ plus communities, BIPOC communities, economics, and love. And I'll flesh those out a little bit because I think those are communities who have significant barriers to reporting and help-seeking behaviors. So when you're a victim or survivor who is undocumented, there's fear of making reports to police, to counselors, because of fear of deportation, a fear of having children removed, and abusers use those vulnerabilities as a tactic and tool to keep folks within relationships because there's just a barrier to reporting. For LGBTQ plus communities, the fear of being outed, the fear of disclosing their sexual identity or gender identity to law enforcement, being judged, disclosing to friends or family what their sexual orientation or gender identity is before they're ready. Abusive partners will use those fears and vulnerabilities to limit a victim or survivor's comfort in making a report or seeking help. For BIPOC communities, there is a lot of historical trauma related to making a report to law enforcement and a lot of distrust and fear of making a report in various systems that have victimized those communities extensively historically. So there's a distrust in making any type of report or sending more Black men or more Indigenous men within the criminal legal system as well. Economically speaking, a lot of victims and survivors and families may rely on an abusive partner to pay bills and keep a roof over their heads. So making a report means the potential for homelessness or the inability to have resources or healthcare for a child who has special needs and needs the really expensive health insurance that an abusive partner provides for them. And then lastly, that piece around love. I mean, when you're talking about intimate partner violence and also family violence, if you're discussing elder abuse or child abuse, a victim or survivor of violence loves a partner and may love a family member who is also abusing them. And making a report it's just a challenging and really complex and complicated process of making an outcry of any kind, because there is also most relationships, intimate relationships, also have really good times and partners who are loving and supportive and healthy in some aspects, but also really unhealthy and violent in others, which makes it really complex and complicated. And so additional barriers to reporting also is just the fear of not being believed. So making an outcry, making a report to anyone and just thinking that whoever I tell won't believe me. So what's the point? Or nothing will happen. Nothing will change if I make this report. So what's the point? And I know I mentioned this earlier, but really sort of broadening our scope of what reporting means, I think is important. So not just really relying on the criminal legal system, but leaning into what survivors are disclosing to us, and how we, the recipient of that information, responds to them. So if a survivor is making a report to you, a friend or family member, understanding what their vulnerabilities are, understanding what their barriers to reporting to anyone else may be, and falling back on being a supportive ally to them and working with them on what they need next to really be safe. And that can be a variety of things. And that falls back again on like listening to what their needs are, believing them and telling them like, I'm so sorry that this is happening to you. I believe you. How can I help you? What do you need right now? And then moving from that piece forward.
Dr. Loud, what are some prevention strategies to reduce family violence victimization?
There are many strategies that have been used. I think if I wanted to really just kind of sum it up, I think first and foremost, a strategy that utilizes a family violence perspective can be very useful. And it's really what we've been talking about since we've been here, is recognizing that this perspective gives you the ability to kind of broaden the scope in recognizing what is considered family violence, who may be impacted by family violence. And it's based on the social construction theory, the different types of theories that speak to celebrating diversity, listening to people, letting people be the narrators of their own stories and their own lived experiences. So like Ms. Hilderbrand is saying, listening and believing people and what they tell you. I think that this perspective also gives us the room to be able to really sit down and grapple with the changing definition of what it means to be a family. It's no longer just a nuclear traditional family of a dad and a mom and 2 kids and a dog. We're seeing lots more blended families. We're seeing families that, have same gender parents. We're seeing all kinds of different family structures now. And so a perspective that is broad enough to be able to give us the tools we need to look at these objectively and try to address it as such is helpful. Generally, there are 3 levels of prevention. At the primary level, that's looking at just basically what we do for the population as a whole without regard for risk. Then at the secondary level, there are those strategies that we use for those who may be at risk have one or more characteristics associated with risk that we talked about. And then there's the tertiary level for those who have actually experienced violence, individuals and families, and we want to give critical services. So examples at the primary level, universal strategies may be just public awareness campaigns, the things we do for raising awareness around by intimate partner violence every year or whatnot. Those are examples of primary prevention strategies because we're keeping it in the forefront of people's minds and letting them know that it's real and it's not hidden. Examples of secondary might be just educational curriculum, maybe going into the schools and talking to kids about what does this look like? What does it feel like when someone treats you good versus when someone, treats you badly, just things of that nature, or teaching about dating violence. And then at the tertiary level, it might be examples of like coordinated resources, such as the agency that Ms. Hilderbrand works at in terms of crisis programs or shelters or whatnot for those in the population who have experienced and need to recover. Another type of prevention strategy could be just working from a position of resilience and strength-based perspective. We always push for that because there are no perfect individuals or families. There's no such thing. And so there's always something. And so if we come in with our prevention or intervention strategies from a position of strength and looking for opportunities to build on someone's resilience, then we're probably going to have a better outcome. And I just say that as a whole, like a whole systemic perspective, not just an individual perspective. I think that's a good way to look at how we can categorize our engagement or our intervention or prevention of family violence.
At TCFU, we utilize a term called survivor-centered services when working with intimate partner violence survivors, and the way you support a survivor in their sort of healing process, which is exactly the same thing, but it's really just honing in on what the survivor needs and following their lead and knowing that they're the expert in their life and in their journey and just sort of helping them along the way with some of the things that we know about the criminal legal system, the civil system, and sort of helping them navigate that process with our expertise, but really letting them be the leader in their journey, which is the most important thing.
Ms. Hildebrand, can you describe the difference between system level advocacy and other types of advocacy?
Sure. So in thinking about like different advocacy types, for me, the systems level advocacy really falls on victim advocates, or they're called, in my world, they're called VACs, VAC for short. And those are advocates that exist within different like criminal legal systems. So there are counselors and advocates and social workers within law enforcement, within court systems, within probation and parole systems, and also within the jail and the carceral system as well, in terms of supporting victims and survivors who are engaged with those systems. I know that there are also advocates within the child welfare system as well, who sort of help families navigate the criminal legal process as they're working through it, usually not by choice. But most folks don't know how to navigate the criminal justice process. It's not something people want to know, and it's usually very foreign. So having an advocate within those different systems can be really helpful as someone to help explain what is happening, offer updates around the criminal legal process, and be there as a sounding board, sort of translating what the criminal world says. On the opposite end of the spectrum of advocacy, there's also nonprofit advocates. And for me and for our work, the domestic violence shelters have advocates that do different type of work. So there's survivor advocates, residential victims advocates, that kind of work that I did in college, of supporting families who are within the shelter and helping them sort of exist in communal living. There are also housing advocates to help families navigate different types of housing options that are available, public housing. There's also different housing options that are available for domestic violence survivors that isn't necessarily shelter, but more like rapid rehousing programs. So those are housing advocates that have a lot of expertise in housing. And then there's also CPS liaisons that work within the domestic violence shelters that have a really strong relationship with child protective services, who have liaisons that work intimate partner violence cases. And then there's also non-residential victim advocates. So your victims and survivors who don't necessarily live within a shelter, but are seeking services like case management, housing support, legal support, but need an advocate that they meet with on a regular basis, even though they're not staying in a shelter. Those are typically called non-residential advocates. And also legal advocates who can help a survivor or a family who is navigating the criminal legal world or also the civil legal world. So things like divorce and custody and those sorts of things. There are advocates who have expertise in those worlds as well. So there are a lot of advocates that exist in our communities who have a depth of knowledge on specific topics. There are also generalized advocates that do all of it. I think where the breakdown happens when you talk about systems level response is just a lack of communication that happens amongst various advocates helping families who have to navigate all sorts of people as it pertains to their particular situation. And it gets really confusing and hard to keep track of. And so my work and my world is about finding ways to reduce those barriers and help different systems communicate better to reduce barriers for families so that they can get the help they need quickly and in a way that's not confusing or overwhelming.
And the only thing I would add to that, when I think about advocacy, a lot of the CPS agencies now, they are doing what's called the alternative response or the family-based safety services. And to me, I look at that as a type of advocacy because it's a different route than the traditional route of going through you're going to go through here, you're going to get this disposition, this like a substantiated report, but you can actually go a different route now and get additional services, or your whole family can get services if there are some needs that are identified. So I look at that as a type of advocacy as well. And then just from my experience working with adult protective services, I look at guardianship, conservatorship also as a type of advocacy because that person is put in place to help keep the client safe, keep their resources safe or whatnot. So I also look at those as other types of systemic forms of advocacy as well.
Ms. Hilderbrand, in a perfect world, how could we improve the systems to combat family violence?
In my world of intimate partner violence, and I think this also goes with family violence in general, the answer to those improvements that are needed amongst systems is coordinated community response. And that is solely focused on leadership within various systems. So leadership within CPS, APS, leadership within shelters, your judges, your police chiefs, your prosecutors, your elected prosecutors, all coming together in the same room to learn about what each other do, actually learn. I think that we know what other systems do, or we have a generalized idea of their policies and procedures of working with families. But when you start to ask detailed questions, that knowledge isn't really there. So, and that creates communication breakdowns. So getting those folks in the room together, learning about what each other's roles and responsibilities are, and then having some really good conversations amongst each other around what are the barriers or the gaps in services that we are identifying, or we're hearing from families that what the needs are, and how do we repair those gaps in services. And with coordinated community response, there are three main goals, which I know I mentioned earlier. It's around reducing barriers for families, enhancing offender accountability, and really promoting family safety and coming together as a community to say, we won't stand for family violence. We're working to actively solve what those problems are within our community. I think as communities have navigated intimate partner violence, especially, we've gotten really, really good at telling survivors what to do with their families. So we order survivors to go to parenting classes, or to get protective orders, or to file police reports, which doesn't necessarily or always equal safety for that survivor. And there's not a lot done around offender accountability. And offender accountability can look different in different ways. So that can be within the criminal legal system. That can also be ordering an offender to attend battering intervention and prevention classes consistently and regularly, so that they can learn the skills and tools that they need to be a healthier partner. But in order to really focus on systemic improvement, we can't just focus all of our efforts on survivors and victims who are experiencing domestic violence. We have to do more with offenders who are perpetrating violence, because we may work really hard at getting a survivor free, but that person is going to continue to find new partners and abuse new or other people. So we need to give them the skills and tools that they need to be better in their relationships with folks. And there are tools out there, and there are tools within various systems to require them to get the help that they need and to promote safety within the community. So in a perfect world, in my vision of a perfect world, or a perfect Texas, because the work is hard and we are a very large state, would be, and we're actively doing this, to help communities get together, get in the same room, have really hard conversations around what is happening in our community and how do we work together to reduce barriers for families and support them in seeking safety and healthy relationships.
I love what you said, Ms. Hilderbrand. I do. Coordinated care in the sense, and then coming together and building the type of policies and regulations that complement one another to be able to address those gaps. When you were speaking about holding offenders accountable, perpetrators accountable, and I started thinking about, another strategy that we really don't use a lot, and I know there are a lot of reasons behind it, but it's the notion of restorative justice techniques, and choosing to look at something other than just a punitive aspect. If we think about all of those risk factors that, maybe some perpetrators are experiencing or survivors are experiencing, we know that didn't happen in isolation, that didn't happen in a vacuum. And so thinking about some of the different ways that are non-traditional, but different ways of addressing violence may be also useful as part of that coordination as well. So thank you for sharing that.
Yes, and if I can just add a little more context to the coordinated community response piece, is definitely about developing ingrained policies and procedures amongst systems to modify the way that they respond to families. So it's not just about having conversations, it's about real policy and procedural change, which is why leadership needs to be in the room to do that work, because they're the ones who can make the changes. I think sometimes these types of meetings get a bad rap because they feel like there's nothing that ever happens. But what happens in those cases is that leadership has sort of checked out of that responsibility, and delegated it to someone else who doesn't have the power to make the kind of change that's needed. So yes, and the restorative justice piece for sure is a component that I think needs to be more heavily ingrained, because we as a society tend to really rely on that carceral system to resolve the issues of violence or community violence, really, which it's not really solving the problem. The problem around violence that occurs is a lot more to do with other pieces around safety and economic justice and racial equity and access to employment and healthcare and all of those other things that make it really complicated and hard, which I guess it's easier to just work in the mindset that if we just put someone in jail, the problem will go away. And that's just not going to solve the problem. We need to really emphasize and focus on proper healing and support and giving offenders the tools that they need so that they can be better partners in the future. And the tools are definitely there and they work. A matter of working together as a community. And it's just a lot. It's a marathon. It's not a sprint. When I go into communities, I'm like, this is not a 1 week class that you can take and then be an expert in. This is 100%. You have to be in it for the long haul, and that change is definitely possible. We've seen a lot of really cool and awesome work happen in communities to support families. It just takes time and commitment.
Ms. Hilderbrand, what are your plans for future systems level advocacy in family violence?
So I know I mentioned this earlier, but in thinking about TCFE's goals for the future in systems level advocacy work, we are continuing our journey of supporting communities and implementing firearm transfer processes. So that, like I mentioned earlier, the presence of a gun in a domestic violence situation increases the risk of homicide by as much as 500%. So as an agency, we're really working on the firearm piece for survivor and victim safety. So we're not calling for additional restrictions in the law, nor are we fighting responsible, lawful firearm ownership, but we're imploring Texas counties and courts to enforce firearm laws that have existed for over 2 decades, but are not properly applied in cases of domestic violence. These laws temporarily prohibit convicted family violence offenders and violent respondents of protective orders from possessing firearms. So not implementing these long existing firearm laws puts victim safety and lives at risk by allowing violent offenders to maintain access to lethal weapons. And this is a community responsibility. It's not just the courts, it's not just law enforcement, it's really ingrained in family violence service providers, letting survivors know that these laws exist to protect them, and developing a process and a protocol to enforce the laws around safe firearm ownership. So if folks listening at home are looking for ways to advocate and sort of follow our lead in these pieces, and thinking also reflecting back on the sort of chilling statistics around intimate partner homicide stats that we experienced in 2020, and unfortunately, I think will be even higher in 2021, as we've started that research already. We would encourage your community leaders and courts and systems to implement a firearm transfer process and enforce the prohibitions to protect vulnerable survivors. So you can talk to community leaders about what they're doing to protect survivors. I would also encourage you to ask your different system level folks what they're doing to reduce barriers for survivors and enforcing offender accountability, and how they're collaborating with one another to do that work, and encouraging them to continue to engage with advocates who are experts in the field, who can support their work to make their work easier, and support families who experience family violence. And TCFE is always an open resource for any community member. You don't have to be a survivor to call. You don't have to be a shelter worker to call. We work with law enforcement, we work with prosecutors, we work with CPS and APS and advocates and students of all ages to really do systems level advocacy work. So if you're interested and you want to learn more and find ways to engage your community in this work, please don't hesitate to contact me or TCFE, and we can have lots of great conversations about what kind of options exist and how we can support your community as well. So,
Dr. Loud, do you have any further comments concerning family violence?
I mean, I think this was a wonderful conversation. For me, I guess some key takeaways I think are important to share is that we should continue to move in a direction of recognizing family violence as a public health issue. I think that will continue to kind of get us going in terms of what we do, the strategies, and how we see it. I do, and like Ms. Hilderbrand, I do think that there is a critical need for integrating a family violence perspective into all of our social or major institutions. We'll really kind of start connecting that network, if you will. When I was in school, we had a counselor. And that was one counselor for lots of kids. Today, there's communities in schools, CIS, that's in a lot of different schools that kind of serves as a link for the children and their families in schools and the greater community in terms of resources or addressing risk factors that are also associated with family violence. I think that's a step in the right direction. We've got the research now that looks at the role of adverse childhood experiences, a quick, easy assessment that can be integrated in almost anything. Also the need for basic screenings around family violence. So to me, integrating it as part of our major institutions kind of moves it from just an individual level problem to a community issue, because it affects all of us, whether we are the direct recipients of violence or not. It affects all of us. The money we spend on it, the things we have to do, maybe your coworker's out of work for a while, there's more work for you. It's just all kinds of things. So those are the types of things that I think about, and I hope that others would take away from our conversation today.
That was all of our questions. We would like to thank Dr. Loud and Ms. Hilderbrand for taking the time to discuss family violence victimization with us. We hope that this information will help others by raising awareness. Thank you for taking the time to watch and/or listen to our CVI Talks presentation. Please stay tuned for future CVI Talks. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Instagram for the latest and greatest concerning CVI.